At 78, ABBA's Benny Andersson finally confirms the truth about her. There are moments in a person's life that arrive without announcement, moments so quiet and so unexpected that the world around them seems to hold its breath. For Benny Andersson, one of those moments came not on a grand stage or in front of millions of fans, but in a room backstage at the ABBA Arena in London, at a piano he had sat behind countless times before. He was 78 years old. The show had ended. The crowd had gone home carrying with them the memory of something magical. And then, in the stillness that followed, Benny did what he has always done when words fail him. He played, and she sang. What happened in that room that night, and what Benny said afterward, has moved people around the world in ways that no ABBA song ever quite prepared them for. Because this was not a performance. This was not a reunion crafted for cameras or a promotional moment designed to sell tickets. This was two people in their late 70s, carrying between them a lifetime of music, love, heartbreak, loss, and the kind of complicated history that cannot be summarized in a headline, choosing to exist in the same space and share something real. For decades, Benny Andersson let his music do the speaking. But on that night, he finally used words. And what he said changed everything people thought they understood about him, about her, and about what ABBA truly was beneath all the glitter and the glory. To understand why those words mattered so much, you have to go back to the beginning, not to the Eurovision stage, not to Waterloo, but further back, to a small apartment in Stockholm where a boy named Benny watched his father pick up an accordion and transform into someone lighter, someone freer, someone alive in a way that ordinary life never quite allowed. Music was not an interest for young Benny Andersson. It was oxygen. It was the first language that made complete sense to him in a world that otherwise felt confusing and too loud. Born on December 16, 1946, in Vasasten, Stockholm, Benny grew up in a household where music existed as a natural part of daily life. His father and grandfather played the accordion with confidence and genuine joy, treating it not as something extraordinary, but as something necessary, like bread or sleep. Benny absorbed all of it. By the age of 6, he had his own accordion. By 10, he was teaching himself piano with no formal instruction, simply listening carefully and trusting his instincts in a way that would define his entire creative life. School, however, was a different story. The classroom offered Benny nothing that the piano did not already give him better. And so by the age of 15, he made a decision that would set the course of everything that followed. He left school and began performing at youth clubs and small stages, chasing music with the single-minded determination of someone who understood, even then, that walking away from would cost him far more than any diploma ever could. His parents were frightened for him. His father feared his son would end up struggling with no stable future. His mother lay awake at night, quietly heartbroken, wondering if she had somehow failed him by not holding firmer, not keeping him in the classroom where the world told her he belonged. But Benny felt a certainty inside himself that no amount of parental worry could shake. He was not running away from responsibility. He was running toward the only thing that made him feel completely and entirely himself. Those early years were not glamorous. They were hard and uncertain, and full of the kind of exhaustion that only comes from caring deeply about something while the world around you remains largely indifferent to it. Benny scraped by on almost nothing. He performed wherever he could find an audience, poured everything he could not say out loud into his music, and kept going because there was no alternative inside him that felt acceptable. It was during these restless, searching years that he joined the Hep Stars in October 1964. He arrived as a young man desperate to prove himself and became, almost immediately, the musical engine of the group. Within months, the band had broken through with a song called Cadillac, and Benny was writing original material with a hunger that never left him. The Hep Stars transformed from a cover band into something with a genuine identity, and Benny was the force at the center of that transformation. But music was moving him towards something much larger. In June 1966, the Hep Stars and a group called the Hootenanny Singers found themselves sharing stages on the same tour circuit across Sweden. Night after night, Benny ended up in conversation with the Hootenanny Singers guitarist and vocalist Björn Ulvaeus. The two men were different in almost every measurable way. Björn was thoughtful and precise, with a careful instinct for melody and language. Benny was instinctive and bold, capable of turning the simplest idea into something that stayed with you for days afterward. What one lacked, the other carried naturally. Their first song together felt less like a collaboration and more like a conversation that had always been waiting to happen. Then came 1969, and the night that changed Benny Andersson's life in a way that music alone never could. At the Melodifestivalen, Sweden's most prestigious song competition, a singer named Annie Frid Lyngstad stood on stage and performed. Benny was in the audience as a composer. He had heard many talented singers in his years. But when Frida began to sing, something inside him went completely still. A friend standing beside him later recalled that Benny stopped mid-sentence and simply stared. He could not look away. They were introduced backstage after the competition. They talked about music the way only two people who truly understand it can, deeply, easily, with none of the small talk that usually fills the silence between strangers. Neither of them wanted the conversation to end. In the weeks that followed, they kept finding reasons to be in the same room. Rehearsals, recording sessions, late evenings that stretched far longer than planned. What they felt between them was undeniable and eventually impossible to contain. Around the same time, Bjorn Ulvaeus had met a young singer named Agnetha Faltskog on the set of a television music special. She was already a star in her own right, gifted and quietly magnetic, and Bjorn was captivated immediately. Before long, the four of them were spending time together constantly, supporting each other's work, harmonizing for the pure joy of it, and discovering in those shared moments something that none of them yet had a name for. What began as friendship and music was slowly becoming something far bigger than any of them had expected or prepared for. The formal beginning of what would become ABBA was not a business meeting or a record company decision. It was four people standing together on a beach in Cyprus in April 1970, laughing and relaxed, far away from the pressure of studios and charts, when someone began to sing and the others joined in. United Nations soldiers stationed nearby stopped what they were doing and gathered closer to listen. The four Swedes looked at one another in the fading evening light and felt it simultaneously. Something rare was happening between them. Back home, Benny and Bjorn were already recording together, and when Agnetha and Frida stepped in to sing backing vocals, everything in the room changed immediately. Their voices wrapped around the melodies like something that had always been missing from them, like a question finally receiving its answer. The edges softened, the songs breathed differently. None of them could ignore what they were hearing, and none of them wanted to. The group's rise from that point forward is one of the most remarkable stories in the history of popular music. Waterloo won Eurovision in April 1974. The song reached number 1 in 9 countries. Suddenly, ABBA was not just a promising group from Sweden. They were international, filling arenas across Europe, Australia, North America, and Japan, becoming one of the best-selling musical acts of all time with a catalog of songs so deeply embedded in popular culture that they have outlasted almost everything else in their era. But behind the lights and success, something quieter and far more complicated was unfolding. And it is that quieter story, the human story underneath the music, that Benny Andersson finally began to tell honestly at the age of 78. On October 6, 1978, Benny and Frida married after 7 years together. They had shared the early struggles, the breakthrough, the tours, the sold-out arenas, an extraordinary experience of watching something they had built together conquer the world. At the absolute peak of everything, they made it official. The world adored them. Fans wept at photographs from the wedding. Everyone assumed that if any couple could survive the madness of what ABBA had become, it was these two. What followed instead was a slow, quiet unraveling of something that had once felt permanent. Benny poured himself into music the way he always had, completely and almost hungrily. Frida held everything else together around him, showing up, performing, smiling for cameras, and coming home to silence whenever Benny stayed late in the studio. She had spent her life learning how to endure, and she endured this too. But something was shifting inside Benny that Frida could feel long before either of them said it out loud. Then one day he came home and told her the truth. He had met someone else. He had already been with her for months, while Frida had been performing beside him, harmonizing with him, sleeping under the same roof. Benny had already built another life elsewhere. Frida broke, not quietly, not neatly. She broke the way a person breaks when the one they trusted most takes everything from them in a single conversation. Because this was not simply her husband. This was the man she had said openly and publicly had pulled her out of her darkest moments. The man who had made her feel, for the first time in a life already marked by loss, that someone truly had her. She still had to walk into the same studio. She still had to stand at the same microphone. Those who were present during those recording sessions described the atmosphere as extraordinarily heavy. Benny's hands shook visibly during interviews from that period. He chain-smoked through conversations about the divorce. He was not untouched by what had happened, but he had made his choice, and Frida was the one left standing in the wreckage of it. The years that followed brought ABBA's quietest and most emotionally devastating work. The album they were recording as their marriages dissolved reflected everything they could not say to each other directly. Bjorn sat alone with a bottle of brandy and wrote the lyrics to The Winner Takes It All. Agnetha stood alone in the studio and sang every word. Both of them insisted publicly it was not about their marriage. Everyone present in that room knew the truth. The song became one of the most emotionally devastating recordings in the history of popular music precisely because it was true, and because the people making it were living inside every single word. ABBA made their final television appearance in 1982. The band dissolved quietly and without fanfare, and then the four of them went their separate ways into lives that looked very different from one another and carried very different kinds of weight. For Frida, the years ahead would bring a form of grief that no amount of stage experience or emotional resilience could have prepared her for. In 1992, she married Prince Heinrich Rutzow-Ruseplauen and moved to Switzerland. She sought peace and stability after decades of music, fame, and private heartbreak. She found something resembling both, for a time. Then on January 13, 1998, a phone call tore through her life. Her 30-year-old daughter, Anneliese Lell, had been driving in heavy rain near Livonia, New York. Her car collided with a truck. She did not survive. Frida flew to the United States immediately. She saw her daughter. She held her. Those who knew Frida from that period said she simply refused to speak about it afterward. Not to friends, not to colleagues, not to press. She had nothing left to give the world. Before the grief could even begin to find edges, her husband was diagnosed with lymphoma. He was 49 years old. The treatment was aggressive and ultimately insufficient. In October 1999, he died. She was with him at the end. Within 22 months, Frida had buried her daughter and her husband. She withdrew completely from public life. Interviews ended. Appearances stopped. She said later that the loneliness she experienced during those years became so deep, it gradually began to feel natural, like something her life had always contained, and she had simply not noticed until now. The world, meanwhile, continued to celebrate ABBA's legacy in ways that grew larger with every passing year. Mamma Mia, the stage musical built entirely around their songs, was seen by more than 70 million people worldwide and became a blockbuster film franchise. Billions of dollars flowed from music that had once been created by four young Swedes who stood on a beach in Cyprus and felt something rare happening between them. Reunion offers arrived and were declined. In the early 2000s, a British-American consortium reportedly extended what would have been the largest offer ever made to any musical act in history, an arrangement involving hundreds of shows across dozens of countries, a figure reportedly approaching $1 billion. Benny addressed it with characteristic directness. He told a Swedish newspaper it was a hell of a lot of money to say no to, but they had decided it was not for them. 7 words. The door closed without drama. What finally changed was time, and what time does to people who have lived through enough. In 2018, ABBA entered the studio again. It was supposed to produce 2 songs. It became a full album. Every harmony carried history. Every lyric carried decades of separation, divorce, grief, and survival. Björn Ulvaeus later described standing in that studio and looking into Agnetha and Frida's eyes and seeing something unmistakable. Genuine warmth. Not performed warmth, not professional courtesy, but the real thing, the look shared between people who have lived through pain together and come out the other side with something still intact between them. ABBA Voyage launched in 2022 at a purpose-built arena in East London. The four members appeared not on stage in person, but as digital avatars created from weeks of motion capture recordings, rendering them as they had looked in 1979. More than 1 million tickets sold. Fans experienced something that felt simultaneously like memory and miracle. But while the world celebrated, Frida was carrying something the audience knew nothing about. In the fall of 2023, her grandson Jonathan died. He was 34 years old and had been diagnosed with stomach cancer. Frida had already stood at her daughter's coffin. Now she watched Enlee's only child fight for his life and lose. She had outlived her daughter and her daughter's son, and yet she still showed up. On May 27, 2025, Benny Andersson and Annie Frid Lyngstad sat together inside the ABBA Arena in London to mark the 3rd anniversary of Voyage. Nobody required them to be there. Nobody was asking two people in their late 70s to face a crowd and carry the weight of 50 years of shared history. But they came, both of them, together, after the show, at the backstage after-party. Benny sat down at a piano. This is what Benny Andersson does when words are not enough. He has always let music carry what he cannot bring himself to say directly. His hands found the keys naturally, without hesitation. And then Frida began to sing. A woman who had believed in him completely, whose belief had not survived the pressure of what they had built together, who had walked back into that same studio after he broke her heart and poured her voice into songs about love and longing because the music required it of her, who had then buried her daughter and her husband and vanished from the world for years because there was simply nothing left to give it. That woman heard his piano and she sang. When the song ended and the room settled, Benny stood from the piano. He looked at her before he looked at anyone else. And then he spoke. He said there had never been anyone else like her. Not in the studio. Not in his life. He said that people believed they understood what had happened between them, but they did not. He said she had carried more than anyone ever saw, and she had never stopped showing up. Not for the music. Not for all of them. His voice tightened slightly as he continued. He called her the strongest person he had ever known. And then he said something that silenced the room completely. He said that whatever they had been, whatever they were now, the truth was that none of it would have existed without her. Not the songs. Not the years. Not him. Frida lowered her eyes. She did not interrupt him. She did not speak. But everyone in that room understood that something honest and long-held had finally been said out loud by the man who had once been unable to say it at all. At 78 years old, Benny Andersson confirmed what the music had always been trying to communicate on his behalf, that the woman who stood beside him through the formation of one of the greatest musical acts in human history was not simply a voice, not simply a former wife, not simply a figure in the story of ABBA. She was, in ways he had never quite found the language for until now, irreplaceable, not just in terms of what she contributed to the sound, but in terms of what she contributed to him, to what he became, to everything that followed. And Frida, who had survived more than most people could comprehend, who had endured loss upon loss upon loss and kept showing up anyway, simply listened as a man who had once walked out on her finally told the truth in front of everyone. She had carried it for decades without complaint and without public bitterness. And in that moment, in a room full of people who had watched their story unfold from a distance for 50 years, something that had long deserved to be acknowledged was finally, quietly, and completely put to rest. Some love stories do not end with a reunion. Some end with honesty arriving late, sitting down at a piano and playing something true. And sometimes that is enough